just don't leave before you signed in, if that's okay. So we can get today we have a very awesome and special speaker with us. Welcome to Freudian Sips number 9, our second Freudian Sips lecture of the year. This lecture is sponsored by the UC Davis Multidisciplinary Psychoanalytic Research Cluster in our second year, now DHI supported. So thank you. I see several people here who have come throughout these couple years of talks. It's great to see you. With us today is Professor Cristiana Giordano, who's a professor in the Anthropology Department of Sociocultural Anthropology. Having completed, she has obviously great education, such. She's
I don't know.
Italy, Berkeley, I don't know if I should go through all this. Italy, Berkeley, postdocs at the UC Davis Medical Center as well as McGill University. And she's what I want to get to, so I'm skipping through that, is that she's just published her book, Migrants in Translation, Caring and the Logics of Difference in Contemporary Italy, that was just released from the University of California Press. It's also in the Kindle edition for those of you who prefer Kindle books. Today's talk, which Professor Giordano has graciously agreed to give, is called Political Therapeutics in Contemporary Italy. That book is based on, this talk is based on both Professor Giordano's work, as well as the fieldwork that it emerged from, which she completed with migrant women and the institutions that surrounded them in northern Italy. Welcome, Professor Giordano.
Hi, well, I know most of you. Most of you know bits and parts of my work. But hopefully we can think together about a fraction of it today. So, this is my book. This is the image of it, and this is the object. And so before I present the paper that I want to share with you, I wanted to give you a little bit about general, very general, because I also go into the larger intellectual project of my book during the talk. So I spent 2 years doing fieldwork in Italy, which is also where I'm from. And I did research on questions of mental health, foreign immigration, and cultural translation. And what I mean by that is that I was intrigued by the fact that Italy, unlike other European countries who had experienced different forms of colonization, and as a consequence also earlier waves of foreign immigration arriving in Europe, Italy experienced waves of foreign immigration mostly from Northern Africa and Eastern Europe later. So around the 80s and 90s, Italy started to receive increasing numbers of legal and illegal migrants. And Italy was a very easy access due to its stylish geography, which also provides lots of coast, and so easy entry into Europe, and also immigration laws that were very, in fact, we only started having a comprehensive immigration law in the late 90s. So it was a very easy access into Europe. And so around the 90s, I became very intrigued by different forms that the Italian institutions came up with, the forms of new practices to face the challenges and the issues posed by newcomers. And so I became very interested in therapeutic practice, ethnopsychiatry, and I started working with a group of Italian psychiatrists and psychologists who were thinking about new ways to address the challenges posed by social and psychological issues, also, or how they were produced. So the stories that I'm going to tell today is a very particular and specific story about a clinical site, the Franz Fanon Center in Turin. I'll tell you a little bit story about it. So you'll hear a very specific story about a specific therapeutic practice that has been emerging in Italy in the last 20 years. And I'll share a clinical case with you. And so it will be extremely specific, and I'll go into the details of clinical interactions. And because I want to show you how this new practice works, but also, and it addresses questions of cultural competence, which is actually it's a broader question that also in medical schools in North America is becoming a very important question, how to address populations coming from context where the language of psychiatry and psychology doesn't make any sense. How can they be addressed and treated and cared for in ways that are called culturally competent? So I'll give a specific case, the Italian case, on how one can deal with this question. But I'm also trying to tell a much larger story, which is a story of how modern liberal democracies are in the West are trying to deal with the question of difference and are producing difference through different institutional encounters. So there are different levels in the story that I would like that I'm going to share with you, and I'm sure you'll hear other things that I haven't heard, I haven't seen. So I'm curious to see also how you respond to this material. I met Mary on a late fall afternoon at the Fanon Center. She was in her early 30s when social services referred her to the ethnopsychiatric clinic in Turin. She had migrated from Nigeria approximately 3 years before I met her, and she was still undocumented. Over this period of time, she had gone back to Nigeria once. When she returned to Italy, she was pregnant, and she had just lost her husband in a car accident in Nigeria. She went to the hospital for a prenatal visit where she was diagnosed as HIV positive. As a consequence, the social services placed her in a locally funded program for pregnant HIV positive foreigners. She lived with her sister in what social workers described as very precarious economic conditions, in a small, dark apartment where a lot of people cycled in and out. And her sister was probably involved in prostitution, but it was unclear whether Mary was as well. She gave birth to Luca, who was HIV positive and then became negative after months of retroviral treatment. A year after giving birth, the social workers thought that she was depressed. She was crying a lot and felt guilty about her health and her son's future, so they referred her to the center, to the Fanon Center, where the doctors, one social worker put it, knew how to deal with cultural difference. Patients often arrive at the Fanon Center after being diagnosed in public institutions at the state hospital, and they're usually referred by health services or by public and religion institutions. And the reasons why they get referred to the Fanon Center is because other institutional actors think, and actually it is the case, that at the Fanon Center they have access to translators or to what they call cultural mediators, so they usually can use their mother tongue in that clinical encounter, which is something that doesn't happen so as easily in other institutional settings. A short time after the initial referral, Mary became one of Dr. L's patients. I sat in on her therapy session for several months, often conversed with the practitioners in charge of her case, and spent some time with her outside the clinic in the apartment that she shared with her sister. 3 people participated in Mary's sessions, Dr. L, a trainee, and myself. In this case, usually there are cultural mediators who participate in the clinical encounter, but in this case there was no Nigerian cultural mediator available. The doctor spoke enough English and Mary spoke enough Italian for them to understand each other, and also Dr. L had a long-term experience of doing field work in Western Africa on issues of healing and witchcraft. And like other practitioners at the Fanon Center, Dr. L held degrees in both psychology and anthropology and was committed to bridging these 2 disciplines in her clinical work. So the short story of the Fanon Center is that in the midst 90s, this group of politically engaged psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and cultural mediators that I worked with opened the Center Fanon in Turin as an alternative clinic to public health services, which offers psychological support to documented and undocumented migrants. There was a response to the forms of discrimination foreigners experience in the Italian healthcare system, which despite being universal, doesn't necessarily provide equal access and care to all. They also advise Italian social workers, volunteers, state bureaucrats, other mental health practitioners who work with migrant populations. And in Italy, this kind of culturally competent service lacks any kind of institutional or economic support. Therefore, when I was doing research, the center was mostly funded by short projects sponsored by the region, by the municipality, and occasionally by the European Union. Italian ethnopsychiatry, which is originally associated with colonial psychiatry and the study of indigenous pathologies, is at the nexus of different legacies and discourses of mental health. On the one hand, it is inscribed within a general revival of clinical ethnopsychiatry in other European countries. For instance, the group of psychiatrists I worked with draw from the experience of Tobina Tan, who is a psychoanalyst of Egyptian origins, who opened a center in Paris, in the first ethnopsychiatric center in Europe, really. He opened it in the outskirts of Paris. It's called the Centre Georges de Bureau, where he uses techniques of reorienting migrants within their traditional healing strategies as therapeutic. So the Italian group is influenced by this French experience, but on the other hand, and this is what I would like to do today through my story, also to ground the experience of this ethnopsychiatric center within the larger history and experience of Italian psychiatry. So the Center Fanon is influenced by the Italian debates around the deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill and the tradition of politically engaged psychiatry initiated by Franco Basaglia in the early 70s. Basaglia and his project of democratic psychiatry, of undoing psychiatry from within, culminated in the Basaglia Law in 1978 that ratified the closure of the asylum and the organization of, and started the organization of community-based facilities as an alternative, as alternative therapeutic spaces and political spaces. And this is what I want to do also in this talk, to link the therapeutic and the political. The ethnopsychiatrists at the Fanon Center are trained in this tradition. Basaglia, who was influenced by existentialism and phenomenology, and later in his work by Italian Marxism and the work of Gramsci, understood madness as a complex nexus of contradiction, institutional, ideological, ethical, medical, political, social, that find their expression in the bodies of patients, and questioned the structure of medical knowledge, practices, and representations. And then the genealogy of the center becomes even more complex because they are also influenced by the work of Frantz Fanon, and the name itself tells that story. And his denunciation of colonial power relations and the violence embedded in all institutions. Through the work of Fanon, they acknowledge the political dimension of suffering, and therefore they try to avoid pathologizing culture and reducing symptoms to a strict medical account. Over the course of several consultations, Mary spoke of her difficulties in Italy. She did not have a residency permit. She was afraid of getting caught by the police and sent back to Nigeria. She feared for her life and her son's future, and she was terrified at the idea that other Nigerians in Italy might find out about her HIV status, which felt like a death sentence to her. She was haunted by dreams about her dead husband and could not talk about him without ending in a desperate cry. The threat of death was a refrain in her stories. Although Dr. L explained to her that her illness did not imply an imminent death and that retroviral treatments could make a great difference, her fears persisted. She once said, "If I take medicines here, I will heal. But if the police sent me back there, I will die." We spent a lot of time speaking about which social program could grant her a residency permit. At first, the stories that emerged in our discussions were mostly about Mary's life in Italy and the pressing concerns she had about her health and legal status. And in conversations with ethnopsychiatrists, what emerged was that what they explained to me was people's pre-migration stories are often impenetrable for various reasons. Many patients who refer to the center have experienced different kinds of violence and abuse, and stories about home often resist narration because they recall a place that is impossible to re-inhabit, both physically and symbolically. At other times, home has been overshadowed by the urge to assimilate, integrate, and become other in ways that live up to the receiving society's standards of behaving and desiring. Italian institutions that grant legal status to foreigners often require clear narration of their migration trajectories and countries of origin. Such pressure often results in confused accounts that are symptomatic of an impossible encounter between bureaucratic languages and the complexities of people's stories and histories. So now I'm going to step back a little bit and give you a larger sense of where this fits in the context of my larger intellectual project. My work and the work that has gone into the book revolves around the mechanisms of translation that various institutions in contemporary Italy use to make the migrants different, recognizable, and includable. The larger context of this is contemporary Europe, where cultural and political identities are being negotiated between a presumed cultural affinity between European countries and an increasingly multicultural and multiracial society forming within Europe itself. In this context, foreigners are often portrayed as a threat, and this is not novelty. In any country, the foreigner is portrayed as such. A threat to national and supranational identity, security, and cultural and religious values. But what is happening in contemporary Italy is that Italy is a country that is still struggling and will probably always struggle to conceive of a new European multicultural society on the one hand, and to deal with its own internal fragmented identities on the other, because Italy only reached unification in 1861, so it's a relatively new nation state, and it's definitely a nation state that is struggling with its own national identity, which doesn't exist or exists only in certain, it's performed only in certain moments and contexts. So my ethnography, my larger ethnography, is a reflection on the therapeutic, legal, and moral techniques of integration and cultural translation that have emerged in response to the increasing numbers of documented and undocumented others, among them refugees, victims of abuse, torture, and trafficking. And in particular, I ended up focusing mostly in my book on the category of the victim of human trafficking, because I encountered several people who were recognized by the law as victims of human trafficking, and that enabled and disabled certain experiences to them. But I also found that the Italian state reveals its legal and moral frameworks, particularly in the way it approaches the issue of foreign prostitution as a form of modern slavery. So now I'm going to give you some theoretical tools to continue listening to the ethnography. Because there are some theoretical claims that I would like to make and that have to do with the larger picture that the story is trying to portray, the questions of politics of recognition within liberal democracies. So cultural difference often gets portrayed as and reduced to an issue of migration. Migrants exist because there are borders. In fact, we could claim that contemporary notions of migration only make sense within the context of the nation state. So while I look at different projects of recognition that emerge in response to what the state portrays as the dangers of foreign migration, I also argue that the issue of difference exceeds the politics of migration. This excess is acknowledged in emerging therapeutic and political spaces that respond to foreigners' needs by including healing techniques from their home countries and by questioning the host society's techniques of inclusion. So on the one hand, my larger ethnography unveils the mechanism of inclusion, exclusion, embedded in states' categories of recognition that, in the case of victims of human trafficking, only functions through the binary of victim-agent. People can only be recognized either as a victim or an agent. On the other hand, by focusing on ethnopsychiatry as a therapeutic response to the need for a culturally competent approach to foreign patients, I indicate how a new politics is possible beyond the binary oppositions of the state and also beyond psychiatric classifications of pathology and normality. In my larger work, I also document ethnopsychiatry's political impact on other Italian institutions such as the church, the police, the social services, which I address in parts of the book, and that are involved in rehabilitation programs for foreigners. At the time of my research, different institutions turned to ethnopsychiatrists for advice on how to be culturally sensitive and psychologically appropriate in working with certain parts of the immigrant populations. And so ethnopsychiatry became central as a practice that not only creates epistemological breaks within the discourse of psychiatry, as I will show in the story of Mary, but it also questions the way the state recognized foreigners and how he identified which victims were worthy of receiving legal rights. The point that I make throughout my work is that all agents involved in the integration of foreigners into Italian society, from state bureaucrats to cultural mediators, from Catholic nuns to ethnopsychiatrists, adopt a model of translation to be able to understand and relate to the other's difference. There is an unavoidable violence implicit in any act of cultural translation, whether acknowledged or not. It is the price one pays for any discourse of integration and inclusion in a multicultural society. The state enacts a violent translation. It does not see the foreigner as an individual with rights and privileges, but rather as an autobiographical narrative that needs to fit the categories of recognition made available by the state. This process involves an act of misrecognition, since personal stories are often irreducible to what the state expects to hear. The Catholic nuns, who I also engage in my work, and state bureaucrats attempt to engage in alternative forms of translation to mitigate the violent effects of misrecognition. So they turn to ethnopsychiatrists for advice on how to be culturally sensitive in their efforts to reintegrate victims of human trafficking. However, they often translate what they learn from ethnopsychiatry into yet other categories of recognition that reduce the other to a familiar presence. Ethnopsychiatry, I'm trying to show, uses other mechanisms of translation that introduce, or that potentially can introduce, an interruption in the discourse of the state, and thus produces a new politics of difference that I understand as a kind of acknowledgement of difference rather than recognition. And here I want to make a difference between policing and politics, and here I draw from the work of Jacques Rancière. But so let me tell you how I'm getting to these two concepts to make sense of this world that I'm trying to share with you. In liberal nation states, recognition is often described through the language of tolerance and inclusion. The term recognition seems to capture both the normative basis of political claims and the violence embedded in them. It comprises techniques that aim to make the social world intelligible to the state. What if the other, though, my ethnography asks, so what if the other cannot neither be known nor recognized? So would acknowledgement, rather than recognition, allow for a different politics of life beyond the logics of understanding and sovereignty? So I understand acknowledgement as the political and ethical act of surrendering the desire to know through already established categories, and of accepting the challenges of difference and the possibility of not knowing, not understanding, and thus embracing misunderstanding. I see acknowledgement as a space for what Jacques Rancière calls politics, not politics, where the other's difference introduces change in established discourses and thus discards pre-existing identities. It's a little dense, but it will become clear through Mary's story. So Rancière makes a difference between policing and politics, which is important to my work. For him, political action is about changing the social order, creating a form of disagreement that changes the meaning of political engagement and redefines what is sayable and visible within a given community. Policing, on the other hand, policing practices, on the other hand, are about the management of given social roles and places that are left unchanged, though rearranged. In light of this distinction between policing and politics, I make a parallel between policing, and I should have put it, I'm very bad with slides. I make a parallel between policing and politics of recognition on the one hand, and politics and acknowledgement on the other. And so now I want to return to the story of Mary and the Fanon Center, because by focusing on ethnopsychiatric practice, I want to show how this practice can provide an instance of politics or moments of politics, where the language of biomedicine is disagreed with and forms of acknowledgement are possible. During one consultation, Mary recounted a dream. Her husband had come to see her to tell her that he had died because his family had done voodoo on them, and that she and their son were in danger. She had to go back to their house in Benin City, Nigeria, to find a wire and then come back to Italy. If she could not find it, something bad might happen to them. On this occasion, Dr. L told Mary not to fear her husband's visit at night. If he comes back in your dreams, talk to him. Try to find out why his family turned their back to you, she said. Later, when we were alone, the therapist commented, in her context, dead people are not just memories or dreams, they're real. She further explained that dreams are an instrument of the present, an experience that provided memories from the past and reworked them in light of the present. This dream brought up other stories. Her husband's family was, in Mary's words, from a village where they did a lot of voodoo. His family was very envious of the couple because they did well financially and they were able to buy a house in Nigeria and migrate to Europe. Moreover, they imagined she had made a fortune during her time in Italy, and now her son would inherit all of his father's money and the house. She was afraid of them and the harm they could do. She said they killed her husband and that they did not protect him enough. They did voodoo on him, she kept saying. And she also would say that her HIV was the consequence of a spell. She also spoke about the bad worms inhabiting her body. They were red because they sucked her blood. She got them because, in her words, bad people had cast a spell on her when she was pregnant. She almost died, but then she saw a native doctor in Nigeria who helped her. Even so, the worms were still in her body. She also heard an ongoing echo in her ears and head that caused a lot of pain. She wanted some drugs because she had problems sleeping, and this was the reason why she agreed in the first place to come to the center. Dr. L, however, did not prescribe any medicine. First, she listened to other symptoms that Mary presented. She had a strong pain in her ears, and the worms went from her head to her feet, to her shoulders and breast, and then all the way down her spine. Her knees were hurting too. Mary had seen her cousin, a healer in Turin, who poured a powder made of pepper and other things from Nigeria into her ear. Along with suggesting that she undergo further medical tests, Dr. L attempted to go beyond the initial depression, the diagnosis of depression. She asked Mary if she could speak to the spirits who were causing her pain. She also inquired if the presence of worms in Mary's body resulted from a failure to perform some rituals as part of her worship of gods and goddesses. In this way, the therapist was letting Mary know that she understood that rituals had powerful meanings and that spirits could speak and be spoken to, even in the clinical setting. Mary explained that the pain had to do with something else. The doctor then asked about her family back in Nigeria. Do they know about your medical problems? What do they make of them? Her mother knew, and her father died after she told him about it. She felt tremendous guilt. Mary referred to her husband, the dead husband, by his African name, Osaliato. Dr. L asked Mary what her other name was and what it meant. Osatwame, she replied. It means God has pity on me. Prompted by Dr. L's questions, Mary said that her father had given her the name. When Mary's mother was pregnant with her, a woman from their village did voodoo, putting her at risk of losing the child. But Mary was nonetheless born healthy, and thus her father named her, God has pity on me. When Dr. L heard the story, she rephrased it by saying, your father was right because you're strong, otherwise you would not be born. You're still strong now. As she later, the doctor, explained to the trainee and myself, asking about the name in Edo, Mary's mother tongue, was a way to create a relationship of trust where Mary could feel comfortable evoking parts of her life in Nigeria and know that the therapist would attend to it. She specified that it was important to know when to ask these types of questions. The purpose is to let the patient express herself in her own terms and let her know what her references are, that her references are not completely foreign to us, Dr. L explained. A couple of months into therapy, Dr. L asked whether Mary talked to her son about his dead father. No, she responded, not without falling into despair. She also feared that her son might be doomed to a similar tragic destiny. While discussing the case with me, Dr. L had shared that it was difficult for her to deal with how the memory of Mary's dead husband played out in the therapy sessions. We knew Mary's sister had gotten rid of any objects related to him in order to protect Mary from her sadness, but he appeared in her dreams and claimed that his family remembered and sometimes either helped or protected. Why don't you put a picture of him in a corner of the house and build an altar to him? Asked Dr. L. Mary started crying. She felt unable to do it. The therapist reassured her she did not need to rush it, but insisted that it would be beneficial to her and to her son. Maybe she could also recite a prayer in Edo, she added, or go to the Pentecostal church. Mary cried hard, but said she would try to pray, but she feared going to the church in Turin because she didn't want other Nigerians to find out about her medical conditions. In the context of endopsychiatric clinical work, practitioners are engaged in finding what they call an intermediate space, a space of mediation, between the therapist's theories and techniques and the patient's way of expressing suffering in an attempt to avoid reducing symptoms to biomedical diagnostic criteria. At the same time, they encourage patients to maintain relations with their respective backgrounds in forms that range from being in contact with family members, speaking their own mother tongue, performing rituals, attending groups or churches with their fellow nationals. Through Mary's case, I became interested in the question of when and how cultural material opens up or closes down the space of therapy. The contours of what counts as the patient's cultural background are in flux. They take shape as the result of a set of relationships that the clinical context enables. I, for instance, was curious about the ways in which Dr. L evoked Mary's culture in relationship to praying in Edo or referring to her African name. What counts as her culture and in relationship to what? And how can this clinical approach be understood in political terms when it is also reminiscent of colonial approaches to indigenous pathologies? In clinical work, the anthropological and therapeutic takes on culture can be at odds, and this was a challenge for me. And yet it is precisely this tension that produces encounters and spaces where categories are undone and a different listening can take place. This way of listening is a response to the new speech that emerges in the discourse of patients. As Dr. L suggested, the purpose of evoking cultural identification was not to identify the patient's cultural background, but to enable them to find a language and a memory that was lost in the process of crossing borders and languages and worlds. I also began to understand the clinical use of cultural material as a way to reintroduce the political dimension of suffering, not just in the language of psychiatry, but also more broadly in the state's politics of integration of foreign others. In order to understand the nature of her symptoms and start a quest for cure, Dr. L referred to the possibility that Mary was a devotee of Mamiwata, the goddess of the waters, dispenser of wealth and abundance, to whom many Nigerians, women especially, are tied by promises of loyalty and worship, and to whom they are offered as bribes before migration. Failure to fulfill the duties of devotion may result in the goddess taking revenge and in the manifestation of bodily symptoms like strong headaches or the worms inhabiting Mary's body. In the case I observed, in the different cases I observed at the Fanon Center, acknowledging the existence of the goddess on the part of the therapist made women feel acknowledged or even validated to a certain extent in a sphere of their lives that other institutions such as the state, schools, the hospital, the church classified as superstition. This acknowledgement was affecting and reducing some of the symptoms they experienced. If we understand symptoms not just as an index that signals the existence of an illness or a disturbance, but rather as a sign or a symbol formed in the interface between the inner and outer worlds, between the conscious and the unconscious, and in which something of the illness is incarnated and manifested, the anger of the goddess or the sense of guilt of the deity, then the therapeutic work revolves around interpretation, not decoding symptoms into diagnostic categories. So psychiatry has, takes a set of symptoms and translate them into a category, into a diagnostic category, and that's a way of decoding experience into categories. But if understanding symptom is a process of interpretation and not decoding, then it becomes a form of translation that I have been understanding. This is very annoying.
Turn your cell phone
Is there a
off.
way we can turn it off?
You can turn your cell phone off.
I mean, I'm supposed to do what I'm saying, but I can see your expressions. You are.
It might have to do with cell phone.
Yeah.
Cell phone don't need the microphone.
So this process of it was me. So this process of interpretation that I am juxtaposing to the process of decoding inherent in medical practice and in medical assessments of illness is a form of translation that I have been understanding through the work of Walter Benjamin's idea of translation as a way to abide and provisionally come to terms with the difference and multiplicity of languages. So translation not as a way of decoding one language into another, but translation as a process that shows what can and what cannot be translated in between languages, and so shows also the untranslatability between languages and not only the translatability between different linguistic worlds. The symptom is in and of itself a translation of sorts. In the context of ethnopsychiatry, various forms of translation are at work. Patients and doctors translate between their different understandings of suffering and cure. Doctors translate between various medical languages, psychiatry, ethnopsychiatry, spiritual sessions, psychoanalysis, and what may count as healing at different moments in the clinical work. I interpret the process of translation at work within the ethnopsychiatric setting as the various processes of translations as forms of acknowledgement of patient suffering that have surrendered the certainty of diagnostic category, or at least at moments they have surrendered this certainty. And therefore this kind of practice can pay attention to the interpretations and enigmas of the patient's speech. Translation here does not decode symptoms into diagnosis, but rather allow for different etiologies to be on the table. For instance, practitioners at the centro usually do not assign the diagnosis of schizophrenia or of depression unless they're dealing with patients who have previously received such diagnosis from clinicians at the public hospitals before being referred to the center. In these cases, they may refer to psychiatric diagnosis to either question them or to continue the pharmaceutical treatments associated with them. Or they may use diagnosis instrumentally when they write psychological assessments for asylum seekers or victims of human trafficking, knowing that certain psychiatric categories can speed up the bureaucratic process of receiving documents, because mental illness is seen as a category also that the state recognizes in its attempt to provide humanitarian support. In trying to recuperate what psychiatry excluded from its field of understanding, ethnopsychiatry creates a space, both therapeutic and political, that aims to use difference, cultural and experiential, as a fundamental variable in therapeutic work. In so doing, one of the ways in which ethnopsychiatrists work is by translating practices, experiences, way of expressing suffering, rituals, symptoms, into the language of what they call culture, into the language of culture. So instead of a fixed notion, culture is a vehicle of translation, a concept that enables different types of interpretation in the clinical encounter. In this context, culture also takes on a political meaning because it introduces a difference that the state, in its various forms, so the public hospital being only one of these forms, can only recognize as belief and thus classify as unreal or untrue. Roberto Beneduce, who is the founder of the Fanon Center and who also visited this campus a couple of years ago, defined ethnopsychiatry as a clinic of ambivalence. I read this as referring to different layers of ambivalence. On the one hand, the patient's ambivalent positions in regard to their cultural identification that shift in the course of life and migration. And on the other hand, the ambivalence of the ethnopsychiatric practice itself, which emerges at the juncture of different and often contradictory ideologies and ways of conceiving what counts as normal, pathological, and ultimately as human. After this consultation, I asked Dr. L why she suggested that Mary pray in Edo or use her African name. I said, what do you mean by culture when you evoke her mother tongue or suggest she attends the Pentecostal church? I was also curious about how she would go about assessing whether patients perceive this kind of references as either persecutory, hunting, or therapeutic. Her response, for me at least, captured the complexity of her position and the challenges inherent in it. She said, sometimes in the clinical encounter, we present patients with pieces of their culture. At times you have to reify culture to make things happen. By using a certain reify idea of culture, you can see how patients respond to it and how they themselves use it. In this way, we understand better what culture means to them. One strategy is to re-immerse patients in what is persecutory in order to become stronger. In the clinic, you use culture as if you were a tightrope walker. You reify it without mummifying it. It's a fine balance, and you create a dialectics among the participants. She continued, explaining that a complex process of reification, manipulation, and creation of what comes to be seen as culture takes place in the therapeutic process and space. In the treatment, there are moments when it is important to present patients with a possibly stereotyped idea of culture, followed by other moments in which the same idea is deconstructed and further manipulated. This is a complex process, she said, something that can slip from your grasp, she added. If you do not know how to handle all the different phases of therapy and the various configurations that cultural references may take in the course of therapy. The idea here is not to reconnect patients to their cultural background, but rather to produce the conditions so that the subject can find ways to be in the world, she explained. The ethnopsychiatry's strategy of relying on cultural material and practices that they understand as familiar to the patient in order to provide care leaves room for a series of questions about the status of what is therapeutic. What happens if and when the tightrope walker falls from the rope and cultures fail? I later asked myself. I was struck how well this image of the tightrope walker captured the tensions the therapists see in their work. Is there a counterproductive potential to this approach, and can it influence therapy's outcome? Or, as Dr. L implied, can being re-immersed in what the patient perceives as threatening within this setting fulfill a therapeutic promise? How can this kind of work posit a new kind of politics for clinical work? Because I'm not the only one who claims that this can be a form of politics. They also describe this practice as a political practice. Within this practice, acknowledging the legitimacy of cultural interpretations prevents the patient from getting caught in one hegemonic discourse of suffering, and provides a different kind of listening on the part of the doctors. The cultural approach provides a space of critique of dominant techniques in clinical work and repoliticizes the issue of difference. For instance, I began to understand Dr. L's suggestions to pray in Edo and her listening to Mary's references to voodoo and native doxo not only as part of a therapeutic approach, but as a political gesture that creates dissonance with the apparatus of biomedicine and the state, which relegate cultural, historical, and economic difference outside of its view. However, the benefits of demedicalizing suffering have their exceptions. In some cases, evoking cultural material within the therapeutic setting can provoke anxiety in the patient. In Mary's case, for instance, evoking the dead husband and his family's magic powers had a persecutory effect on Mary. So I was caught in another set of questions regarding the failure of culture as a concept that could heal. Or rather, I understood cultural interpretations as a vehicle of mediation that at times need to be suspended and bracketed, just like psychiatric diagnosis. In one of our conversations, another ethnopsychiatrist, Dr. A, told me of the case of Joy, a Nigerian woman who complained about hearing voices and feeling the presence of spirits inside her head. In particular, she had reported a dream where a spiritual husband, how she called him, sat on her head and ejaculated. Devotees of the possession cult of Mami Water, he explained to me, are married to a spiritual husband, which is another way to refer to Mami Wata, the goddess of the waters. But their devotion is often discontinued or tainted with ambivalence once they leave Nigeria. Nonetheless, patients may experience that the ties with the divinity cannot be completely severed, and thus feel haunted by her presence. During one consultation at the center, one of the practitioners made reference to the presence of the spiritual husbands in Joy's dream, to which she responded with a high level of anxiety. She stood up and started walking fast in circles while speaking to the spirits. At one point, Dr. A intervened because he realized that the spirits were threatening to Joy, and at that point of the treatment, the therapeutic team was not capable of handling such forces. He commented to me that if you invite spirits into the consultation, in his words, you must know both how to let them in and how to send them away. In that instance, he reassured Joy that the medication she was given at the public hospital would help her get rid of the voices and feel better. He therefore resorted to what